Hi, I'm Kayla Hathaway, partner here at Simpatico. I'm launching our climate.edu channel to help students learn about the degree programs that are training the future leaders of the green economy. I'll be interviewing graduate program leaders about the degrees offered at their schools, how applicants can best prepare, what to expect as a student, research and internship opportunities, and long-term career prospects. I'll also be asking renowned professors and grad students for their thoughts on the types of skills undergraduates should focus on developing as they prepare for a master's or doctorate program. And now, on to today's show. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Climate EDU channel. Today I am joined by the lovely Jordan from Colorado State University. She's a PhD candidate at the Department of Atmospheric Science, Colorado State University, where she researches large-scale tropical climate variability and its relationship to tropical cyclone and hurricane activity. Today, she's joining me to talk about CSU's recent Atlantic hurricane season forecast that was published on August 5th. Jordan, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and thank you so much for inviting me to do this.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for coming on, and I'm really excited for this conversation. Cyclones are an incredible force of nature.
They definitely are. And, kudos to trying to break down this entire document. I know it's a handful for anyone who isn't a scientist to read. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was looking through the graphs and everything and was like, oh man, we need to have a pro on here to really talk about this. um, Yeah, so before we dive into all this, though, I wanted to follow up and ask, like, with COVID-19, how has this been affecting your work in the Department of Atmospheric Science?
So we have been really fortunate at the Department of Atmospheric Science to be run by a really competent head of staff and a head of department. CSU has also been really on the ball with COVID-19. I think we closed down in time. We went into lockdown in time
Mm.
just to sort of stem that increase in cases. But yeah, we're all doing okay. No reported cases in our department.
That's good.
So yeah, we're doing good.
That's a relief that there's no reported cases in your department.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, well, really glad to hear that everyone there they're handling it well and that everyone's healthy.
Thank you.
Oh, well, so to start trying to break down this recent report, so if you can, for those that don't really know much about these reports and what purpose they serve, could you go and give us a little bit of information about that?
Sure. So Colorado State University is world renowned for having one begun that um, having begun seasonal forecasting of hurricanes in the first place. The venture was started by William Gray in 1984, who kind of pinpointed all of the predictability that comes from the large scale environment, and that it has such, that climate itself has such influence on hurricane activity. Particularly, well, not particularly, for the North Atlantic, for the North Pacific, and globally. So we've been doing it for a number of years, I think around 38.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a really long time. Dr. Phil Klotzbach, a research scientist in our department, sort of spearheaded and took the baton from Dr. William Gray. And just to break down what we do with those forecasts, we take patterns that we see and observe in the environment, and we try to explain or try to quantify how much hurricane activity we expect,
Mm.
based on what we see and based on what we expect the environment to look like later down in the year. So you'll see a lot of that, a lot of environmental predictors. You'll hear a lot of buzzwords like sea surface temperatures and vertical wind shear and El Ninos and Atlantic SSTs. So yeah, it's just taking all of that environmental information and trying to surmise what hurricane activity will be like for the Atlantic.
So, with this recent report, there was one published earlier this year. I think it was in April. Um,
Yes.
so, what makes this updated report different from the April publication, and what warranted the update?
Good question. So what we do is we try to update our forecasts as the year progresses forward. It's essentially trying to update it with present information that's currently or in real time being observed about the environment and how it evolves. So it's essentially a way to sort of correct at each point and fine tune that those predictions. Um, Also, what we would have done, I think, since the first hurricane was named, is that we'd have updated those forecasts to include what hurricanes have already gone and what hurricanes have already been named. So we're up to like 10 now. So yeah.
Yeah. So I think it was an early season this
Yes, it
year,
was.
right?
Yeah.
I remember seeing a lot of stuff on Twitter about that. They're like the first season or
Yeah.
first cyclone. Like,
Yeah. Yes, yes.
hmm.
I think it appeared around late May. So yeah, it was really gung ho from the beginning. And it's still going. So
Yeah, I think is there a like a potential storm that's being watched right now in the Atlantic, or was that a
yep,
couple? Okay.
yep. We're currently looking at tropical storm Josephine that intensified today.
Oh.
So oh yeah.
Uh,
2020 is on a roll.
yeah, I think I was reading in the report that the updated predicted total amount of storms was up to 25,
Yeah,
24,
we're at
25,
24,
24.
total 24. Yeah. And we're at about 10, which means we're expecting 14 more named storms.
Oh my gosh. And for those that don't know, what makes a storm get a name? At what point does a tropical depression suddenly
Hmm.
become a tropical storm or
Hmm.
cyclone?
Right. So we tend to use the Saffir-Simpson scale that breaks down intensity of storms into wind intensities. So for a tropical depression, I think that's about greater than 30 miles per hour. And that is what we call maximum sustained winds.
Okay.
Right. And then anything above, I think, around, is it 65? Then you're approaching tropical storm strength. And then, once you get into those 100 miles per hour regions, now you're starting into hurricanes and categories 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5.
Really, really fast wind speeds.
Yes, yes.
um, on a side note, have you actually been able to go out and experience a cyclone? Or
No, but I have come close. We did have a field campaign out in the Pacific at one point, and it was the captain's prerogative to not be in the way of those storms as they moved by. So
Mhm.
I observed them, but no, I was not in contact with them.
But well, safety first, definitely,
Yeah.
especially if you're on the sea. You don't want to
Yes, yes.
too much that could happen. So with these forecasts, there's been a lot of conversation about climate change and how it's been intensifying cyclones.
Mhm,
So the question I have is like, do these forecasts take into consideration climate change, or like how
mhm.
is that included, or how do you talk about it?
Mm. So no, currently these forecasts do not take into consideration climate change. Um, and that's understandable because climate change is hard to attribute. Hurricanes and tropical cyclones are really complicated and they have various aspects of them. You may find that there are trends, distinct trends in certain types or certain aspects of storms, for instance, in the intensity of those storms, or in the rain rates or precipitation associated with those storms. But you may not see a trend in something like the total number of storms that develop. So, and even then, we can't usually attribute climate change until the storm has already passed. So that is when we have the most information about the storm, about what the rain rates were. We cannot in real time attribute climate change, which is usually why we don't talk about it in the forecast document. But yes, there are definitely signals of climate change that occurs in storms. It's just about how to attribute them.
Got it. So, for these storms, in order to, because as you said, it's after the storm has gone by, do
Mhm.
these storms have to have made landfall in order to calculate the climate change effect, or could they have just dissipated over the ocean and
Yeah, well, both are both are very valid. For one, there are so many different ways to track storms now. I mean, you have satellite data, you have ocean and buoy data, you have what is now known as reanalyses data, which is a combination of observations from instruments and then data assimilation, which is where you kind of try to connect all of the sparse data that you have to have one stable and homogeneous set of data to to work with. But no, it's not limited to land observations. You can definitely get observations over sea as well.
right, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the longest time, I thought that it had to be landfall because then you could actually see the effects on like the community where it had made landfall. But now that we have all this technology out in the ocean
Mhm.
to just be like ping the satellites and be like, "Hey, this did this. This is kind of weird." That's really awesome. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Science has definitely come a long way.
Yeah,
Um,
but it still also has a really long way to go.
mhm.
Land observations are, well, it's not just land observations, but observations in general still go a long way to verifying forecasts and all these different tools that we use. But you have to have a lot of observations as well to stitch the whole story together.
Mhm.
So.
And so speaking of like going observations and specifically those of landfall, so what defines a bad year in terms of these kinds of forecasts? Like,
Ooh.
would that be like Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria levels, or what
Mhm.
um, would make a bad year for cyclones?
Um, that is an interesting question. So I think a bad year for anyone will very likely be when you have the most favorable environmental conditions for
Mm.
hurricanes to develop. And that's essentially what we're seeing now. It's these warm Atlantic sea surface temperatures versus this really cool Pacific, and that really cool Pacific is what they term either a cool neutral or a La Nina event, which
Mm.
is the opposite of an El Nino event, which is a warm Pacific. And what happens is that normally over the Atlantic, you have winds that go from west to east.
Okay.
That's from the Pacific to Africa, towards Africa.
Okay.
But when you have the reverse, there's Atlantic SSTs, warm Atlantic SSTs, and cool Pacific SSTs. The winds reverse. And that ends up subduing winds over the North Atlantic. Those winds are what protect us from storms.
Oh.
So if those winds are subdued, then hurricanes and basically have the right of way to go and develop along with warm ocean temperatures, and they just power up and move across the Atlantic. And that is what we're seeing now. We're just seeing a very favorable environment for hurricanes. And it also means that we can see the most intense storms form.
Oh my. Um, yeah, that's my first thought. I was like, oh my. Um, so, and then the frequency of storms that make landfall, because like the 25 or 24 that's predicted in this report, it's not 24 storms that are predicted to go and like make landfall like in Puerto Rico or Florida, right? It's just the total number that will just form.
Right, right. The total number we expect to form, or that we expect from this particular environmental conditions.
Got it. And so is it with the environmental conditions that you observe that these forecasts are obtained through that research, or like how do are these forecasts like obtained in the first place?
Hmm. Okay. So essentially what happens is that we'll take time series of different environmental conditions, as I was saying before, warm SSTs as one
Mhm.
predictor, and then there's the cool Pacific as another predictor. Um, so what we can do is kind of gauge based on how warm or how cold those sea surface temperatures are, is essentially how much or what kind of or what degree of activity we're likely to get. So if they're like a cool neutral, therefore they're not past like 1 degree change, then you'll very likely get what we call neutral conditions. It means that any storm could very likely power up. There's not much driving force of the environment. So another set of things that we do with this forecast is that we also look back on historical seasons of hurricane activity. So you'll hear a lot about analog years. You'll hear about 2005. If a lot of you have been on Twitter, you could hear a lot of references to that 2005 and that very active, actually the Atlantic's most active hurricane season. There was also 2017, 2010, and essentially all of these years have the same environmental conditions that we're seeing now. So that's one of the things that gets factored into the forecasts.
Interesting. So I didn't know that like taking all that data and compiling it and then having that, sorry, the gears in my brain are just like rapidly turning like, oh
It's
whoa,
fine.
like this is
It's a
like,
lot.
and oh, it's good a lot though.
Yeah,
Weird sentence, but um just understanding how complex these reports are and
yeah.
like what it takes to make one. um I can only imagine like the amount of time to go and really analyze these things to put it together.
Yeah.
So with the reports, when they get published, what other than like being informational about, hey, we'll probably have like 24 name storms. What's the recommendation for like the average person who sees that and is probably like, oh my god, like what do I do?
Hmm.
Like seeing that, like, because it's a big number, it's a little
It
bit
is.
spooky. So like
It
what's
is.
advice for like the average person who lives in cyclone prone areas?
Mhm. Okay. So first thing, remain calm. I know they are definitely very scary numbers. But the first thing to do is to remain calm. Second thing to do is to be as informed as possible. There are a lot of emergency management agencies. I'm pretty sure there's one for just about every state. Um, they will very likely have the plan in place or a plan in place to either relocate you or evacuate you if there is an approaching storm. Um, Yeah, and I think that you can find that information on ready.gov. You can find that information on FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. Um, and yeah, I mean, there are a lot of professionals. I know there are a lot of professionals out there that are very willing to give advice about building an emergency plan for you, you know. Uh, Third thing is to bear in mind that one, the forecasts are an information and preparedness tool. They're there to build awareness from early on in the year, right? We've known that there would be an active season from as early as April, and we've been talking about it consistently over Twitter. It's been a buzz ever since.
Yeah. I've been seeing like the trending. It's like, oh,
Yeah,
hurricanes. It's like, oh no.
wonderful. But yeah, I mean, we knew that this was coming, and that with an increase in activity, with an increase in the number of hurricanes expected, there's definitely going to be a likelihood of landfall.
Mm.
Um, and it's also good to also keep in mind that just because there is, let me rephrase that. It only takes one storm, no matter what strength it is. You know, it could be just a tropical storm. It can still do massive damage. It can be a rainmaker. It can give a lot of rain, or it can give a lot of wind, and you have to be prepared for both. And thankfully, there's also the National Hurricane Center, NWS, that will, you know, inform everyone about the impacts, storm surge, wind impacts, rain or flooding. There's a lot of information out there and a lot of agencies to help you sort of process what an active season will be like.
Yeah, definitely on the statement of it only takes one storm, regardless of the impact of it. It reminds me of the images that were coming out of Puerto Rico after. I'm not even sure if it was labeled a hurricane at that point, or if it was still just a tropical storm. But
Hmm.
I think it's Isaias, if I'm pronouncing it
Hmm.
right. And that realization of like, wow, that was barely a Category 1,
Right.
and what happened there. And I know it's kind of like a joke in Florida where it's like the Waffle House
Yeah.
indicator. Like if Waffle House is open, then it's no big deal. But it's like, I mean, it could still be a big deal. Like, don't listen to Waffle House.
Definitely, definitely.
um, yeah, but well, that went by really quickly. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jordan. We're gonna run the end credits and hop into just chatting. Um, or actually, so I have a good question from Ken. So before we
Mhm.
end the recording, so he's asking, when hurricanes are getting forecasted, they often display a handful of different models showing somewhat or significant different directions for each. Which do you prefer, or which do you use in different circumstances?
Ooh.
Like the spaghetti model? It's the.
This okay, that's a good question. And both. It usually depends on the situation. One, um, each model usually has their own uncertainty. So it's best to look at both and sort of, I guess, I guess it's what you call like expert intuition, or you know, just like an expert guidance. You know, which model to follow, which one gives the best representation of a storm that is currently within the vicinity. But generally, what we do is to look at both of them and to take both into consideration. And I know that can give opposing views at times, opposing forecasts, but we usually tend to do a pretty good job of taking both uncertainties pretty well and giving you the best possible advice based on both of them or all of them.
It's like the professional's gut instinct.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I guess you need a lot with hurricane forecasting.
Wonder how, like one day, well, I guess it would go against physics, where it's like you have, well, or it'd have to deal with like the wind, but say like you're like tracking a cyclone and then it just suddenly is like, we're just gonna go completely backwards now. Like sudden change of direction.
That could happen. It
Really?
could, yeah. We have a lot of storms that have done that too. They do like a loop de loop, or like a U-turn.
Mhm.
It's definitely possible.
Oh
But
man.
yeah, um it's like, as I've been saying for all this entire episode, it's a lot of information, and it's a combination of what is being modeled or given from dynamical models, and and observations. It's a combination of both. So yeah, it's a lot, I know.
Well, I'm glad that we have incredibly smart people like yourself working on this. Um, as like just staring at myself, I'm like, okay. All right, we'll move us into just chatting. We have a question that we'll answer in there. So
Okay.
we'll be right back, chat.